Yeah, at the moment I'm based in Barcelona. I've been here for 5 months. Before that, I was based in Switzerland, in the German-speaking part. Largely the reason I was there was my girlfriend, who I'm with now. Um, she's from Switzerland, and I was previously, a few years ago, in South Korea, and I had no essential specific future plans or direction or location to go after that. And after meeting her, she invited me to stay and live with her in Switzerland, which sounded like a good plan to me at the time. So here at the moment, I am actually full-time focusing on work that is related to my discipline, which for me is movement. Previously to this 5 months, actually, I was also working teaching English as well. So this is something I was doing since 2014, was teaching English.
Teaching English to adults, to adolescents, to kids, anything?
All of it.
All of it.
Yeah, all of it. So 2014, I was located in Czech Republic. I spent almost a couple of years in Czech Republic where I taught English. I was doing some coaching stuff on the side, but in this time I had more of a calisthenics practice, which was great because near more it's not actually geographically Eastern Europe, but if we speak historically about Eastern Europe or the Eastern Bloc countries, in this area, there's a huge calisthenics culture there.
Okay. Were you part of it?
Yes.
Did you slowly kind of get in touch with the people that were part of the culture?
Yeah, I mean, inevitably, yes, but I have had this tendency throughout all of my physical practice time to be what some people might call a lone wolf. Although, the lone wolf terms sounds a bit like, yeah, I don't need anyone. I most certainly could have benefited from having other people around. But to keep it simple, like without trying to sound like a boss, so to speak, like people weren't training like I was training. So it was difficult to have people that I could consistently train with at whatever level it was I was at the time. Of course, if I made more of a proactive effort at the time to seek people who were doing crazy stuff, because there were other places in Czech Republic, such as I was in Prague and in Brno at the time. I think it's Adam Raw. You know Adam Raw?
Never heard of him.
Yeah, big calisthenics guy on YouTube. I haven't been using YouTube for these types of things for ages. But anyway, yeah, I would have had the opportunity to meet with him if I actively went out and did that, but I wasn't very proactive at this particular time. Not like I am now. I'm a lot more proactive in trying to establish relationships, connecting, learning, which is a big part of my personal practice and what started for me as the MoveMore project.
May I ask you really quick?
Yep.
So currently, you're based in Barcelona. You've had this background, traveling the world, teaching English in different locations, and during this traveling and teaching, you were also kind of developing yourself, both in terms of your own personal practice, but also as a coach. Now you're in Barcelona.
Mm-hmm.
Are you teaching group classes? Are you doing one-on-ones? Are you doing online coaching? Are you doing seminars? Are you doing all of these? What are you doing in Barcelona?
Yeah, so I teach classes at a CrossFit box. The classes are movement classes, however that wants to be interpreted, or however I choose to interpret it. So this is just a few classes a week, and I like to establish this because for me it's important to maintain sharing what I see as this is a complete misnomer, but movement training. I don't really agree with this term, but we'll use that for now. I just like to show some of these other elements to people who may not be acquainted with other tools or methodology or techniques that I hope would be useful for them. So I do like to maintain this class element, and being in Barcelona and teaching classes at a CrossFit place or any other, I think, fitness facility, you don't do it for the money. That's for sure. So I keep that element there, but a lot of my focus is towards workshops. So I organize workshops essentially to wherever will have me in Europe.
So you have to travel around. It's not like you're based in Barcelona and you teach them out of Barcelona. You travel around to whichever country has a facility that is interested enough to host you as a guest and a teacher.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, I knock on doors. I've always knocked on doors. This is how I was brought up in terms of work, that if you needed work, you go out and you get the work yourself. As a child, I was knocking on doors selling fish. I used to wash people's cars. We used to do a variety of stuff. We used to buy big boxes of crisps and sell them at schools. I used to milk CDs and sell these things as well. And it was all for my dad. My dad has always been a hand grafter and a hand worker. He was a fisherman all his life. So this comes from the culture of if you want extra money, you got to work. And easiest way, sell something. Yeah, buy it for cheaper and sell it. And I'm in the industry now of, if we reduce it to the element of buying and selling, that I provide a service. Which is, for me, actually, it's an educational service, exactly the same as the educational service I was offering when I was teaching English and providing. So right now, as I said, I do the classes, I do workshops, which is more of my passion because I really enjoy sharing in this format. And I enjoy the closer connection with the hosts and also with the participants as well.
Yeah, I guess the participants that come to the workshops as well, they're a little bit more invested in, you pay more money. Totally. You travel maybe from somewhere far away to come and attend this a 3-day or 2-day seminar. So the people that come there are particularly interested in what you have to say, as opposed to classes that are available every week. So it's, I guess, I'm just trying to put myself in your shoes, and I'm thinking, workshops. When people come to workshops, they're a lot more invested in the content and the information you have to provide.
Yeah, it's true, and I've kind of, it goes through phases, but I'm falling out of interest of the classes element, mostly because I think for whatever you're teaching, whether it's a type of movement practice or a physical practice as a coach, or whether it's, teaching English, unless you have a group of people that are there specifically for that, it becomes very difficult. And what I mean is, I've taught for many, many years in loads of different CrossFit places. And I really love CrossFit people because they like to work. It is great. They'll do the work, which is really, really nice. However, which is I can completely understand, if it's not directly related to your discipline, if the connection is not so clear, the enthusiasm can be lower, which I can completely understand, because if you go to CrossFit, you do CrossFit. The same as if you go to, for example, a movement facility, you go there for movement. Or if you go to a ballet school, you go there for ballet. So if you go to your ballet class and there's another option of, for example, a floor work class, it might interest you a bit, but it's not necessarily, well, in your mind, you may not make the direct connection that it's going to improve your ballet, for example. So when I enter the spaces such as CrossFit places or anywhere that's not specifically for movement, it can be difficult to establish regular classes in a community that's working towards what I see as the goal of developing physical movement potential.
Try your wings in the sun. You won't be here for long. Minutes old beats so hard inside your breast.
So I think this is also one of the reasons that I really love the online coaching and the online coaching platform that I've been developing as well, because I really like to have hands-on kind of connection with someone developing their practice. That's what I really like. I really like to help people progress in a practice that I know that they are connected to, and I know that they are essentially doing. Because as I said, if I'm just teaching classes a couple times a week, it's very, very difficult to set out, for example, just specific goals with regards to a movement, like a progressive skill, let alone another overarching progression for that as well. So I kind of started to fall out of love with the classes that I offer in other facilities. Although I do enjoy sharing the material, it's just as things go in phases. I was really, really enthusiastic about just sharing stuff before. I still am interested in sharing. However, the platform has changed. I'm more enthusiastic about sharing, for example, in the movement workshop. I do also do specialized workshops in terms of handstand, ring strength, and mobility. However, again, with these, I'm kind of falling out of love with these as well. After a time, I guess you become a little, perhaps when I say you can afford to be in more ways than one, you start to be more on your own terms, is in the idea of, hey, this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm sharing, and I don't really want to compromise it. Because there's always an element of compromisation.
It's funny that you mentioned this, though, because in the beginning, it seems like you don't really have the option. You know, it's like in the beginning, I have to tailor my desires to my resources. And if I don't have a lot of resources, I have to kind of like, okay, I'm going to teach a hand balancing workshop because hand balancing is sexy, movement is too ambiguous, it's hard to sell. So I am going to teach a hand balancing workshop and a ring work workshop because it's also relevant to yogis, it's relevant to CrossFitters, and it's a way to earn a living. And then slowly, as you build both your own personal practice and you become more familiar with your own what would I call them? Predispositions, orientations, tendencies, likes and non-likes. You start setting certain standards for yourself, and once you're able to slowly kind of afford to say no to this and yes to that, you'll slowly transition into that. But it needs some time before you establish yourself as a coach within the community, if I may call it that.
Yeah, and one point you made is really important for me, and I think if you're any type of physical practitioner, if you have a physical practice, for me it is, especially if you're sharing it, whether that's coaching or teaching or whatever you're doing, is what is the practice and how, because I believe it should, how does it apply to your wider perspective of life, or what for me I would call my movement perspective? How does it apply to that greater thing? Because if the physical practice is only about the physical practice, for me that's not enough. Like if it was only about physical practice, I'd be out, because it's not worth it. Like the amount of time that needs to go into the physical practice, if the only reward is the physical practice itself, for me that's not enough. There needs to be something cognitive, which there always is anyway. Always, it needs to inspire something else too. So when I say if people are sharing, as you said, whether they feel, okay, I'll do the handstand workshop because it's more appropriate for the yogis or to get more people here and there. For me, I had to ask the question, okay, so if I am doing a handstand workshop, there has to be something else too. It's not just about the handstand. For example, I'll do workshops that are all about floor work, but it's not about floor work. It sounds very almost Joseph Bartzi, like it is not. But what I mean by it's a movement workshop, but we're focusing on the movement aspect of floor work. And I always tell people, hey, if you want to learn good floor work, or if you want to really go to a fantastic hand balancing workshop, don't come to my workshop, because there's better people who can teach you this specific subject. However, if I present something like floor work or hand balancing, it's in the context of a movement practice. It's in the context of my movement perspective. So I think it's very important to develop your own perspective on something like hand balancing, or your own perspective on something like floor work, and share that. So rather than just sharing how to do a handstand and balance on your hands, make it your interpretation of it. And that's for me what gave me more the confidence to share things that I might have thought I wasn't quote unquote qualified to share. For example, I'm not the most beautiful moving on the floor, or, I haven't got my one arm, I can't share a handstand. Yeah, you can, of course you can. However, I think it's also important to say, okay, what is it about the handstand that interests me? Like, why did I get into handstands? Why did I pursue this? What is it useful for? If it's just about standing on the hands, as I said again, that wouldn't be enough for me, just being upside down. There's something else. And I think if, as a coach or as a trainer, or if you want to share something like this, it's important to find out what that thing is that attracted you to it, and share that as the inspiration.
This, then, is an adventure that will take us deep into the past, into our present, and into the future. It's a rich tale from many sources. The stories which these fellows bring us are the stuff our dreams are made of, and in our secret mind, we live them. Then in the end, science takes over from the imagination, and behold, there are even greater wonders than we dream.
A lot of the times you'll say I teach movement to someone, and it's like what the fuck does that mean? It just sounds very ambiguous, and it is, which is it's there's a pro to that and there's a con. I feel the pro to it is that it's open to interpretation, as you said, but you need to think deeply about what it means to you, and that's your interpretation of what the movement perspective is. It's not like there's a solid definition of what the movement perspective is, as a lot of people expect, when they first get introduced to it. It's like, but what is the movement perspective? What is the clear definition of this thing called the movement perspective? It varies, and you'll notice there are commonalities between every person's interpretation of what a movement perspective is, but there are also individual differences. And it's just a nice point you make. It's a profound point. It's a subtle one, but it's I think people tend to fall into this trap of looking for clear definitions, as opposed to looking for a definition that works for them. And in this case, it seems like once you decided to say, okay, I need to think deeply about why I'm practicing handstands and what initially got me into it, so that I end up practicing it for years and years on end. If I'm able to clearly articulate that, then I could possibly find a way of communicating that to somebody else to help them justify the reasons why they may want to pursue a handstand or hand balancing practice.
or
Or
not,
not.
on the other
Or
hand,
not.
as well.
Or not.
That's also important too. It's the idea that you can do what you want, but you can't want what you want. So you can do what you want, but you can't want what you want. So the idea is that you look at in the popular media what you often see as perhaps a movement practice, which might be elements of hand balancing, gymnastics, ring strength, coordinative drills, object manipulation, some of these particular movement aspects. So you look at all these things and you can do whatever those ones you want. Like, I can choose that, or that, or that. Yeah, perfect. So I can do the hand balancing, but there's other stuff as well. So it may be the fact that what you really want, which may be that you don't want to do the handstand. You just think you should do it because that's what movement practitioners do, right? So you think in your head, nah, if I want to really get into this, I have to like do the handstand stuff. I have to get on the floor and start, I have to be juggling like 4 tennis balls, or else I'm not the movement practitioner. And it kind of masks what perhaps you might want, which might not be that. I've had close friends come to me. I want to do it. Yeah, the movement thing. Yeah, I want to. Let's go. Let's do it. And I start them off with small programming and things like this, and we meet up and we discuss. And then after a while, they're like, you know what? I don't want this. And I say, perfect. That's the best conclusion that we could come to. It's a definite conclusion that the type of physical practice that is common to a movement practice is not for you. And then very often after, they start re-emphasizing effort into other projects that actually were what they really wanted. Like, for example, developing their online business, or more entrepreneurial things, or a more artistic endeavor.
Or you could even go within a more micro level, like within the movement practice itself. Like, for example, I myself have been avoiding doing any of the soft acrobatic stuff for a very, very, very long time. I mean, a lot of people have been doing the soft acrobatic stuff for, let's say, the past 2 or 3 years. For an example would be Niels or Will Brown or Lucas Flint, or, I know a bunch of these people that have been doing this stuff for not that long if you think about it. A couple of years is not that long in the grand scheme of things. And I always felt like, oh yeah, I would love to kind of do this kind of stuff. I would like to slowly enter it, but I just didn't, because I was more interested in other things like jiu-jitsu, for example.
I would simply say, just because you don't want to, it's fine. Like, you can say, no, I don't want to do it.
I was just like not ready for it. I was like, I just didn't want to do it. I kind of looked at it. I was kind of attracted to it, and I was like, shit. The movement culture is evolving. I'm no longer part of it now, because now there's this thing. Fuck it. Fuck the movement culture. Jiu-jitsu. And I slowly kind of, I basically, what happened with me is I got really injured with jiu-jitsu the past 6 months, and that was a reason for me to slowly transition into developing my own personal practice again, because I completely abandoned it, put everything on kind of maintenance mode so that I could dedicate my entire time to training, to jits. And then I slowly now kind of started redeveloping my practice, and now soft acrobatics seems like something that I'm ready for. I'm like, yeah, fuck it. I'm going to slowly get into it. It's interesting, because during the time I wasn't in it, I felt like I was slow. Movement culture was evolving without me. And I was like, shit, I missed the boat on this one. Uh-oh. And it's a weird feeling. It's a weird feeling when you feel you're part of a culture, but the culture is evolving in a way that you don't necessarily want to be part of at that point in time. Yeah. And then, you realize later on, maybe a year or 2 years down the line that, okay, it's not like I missed the boat or anything. I could always come back to it. I could always work on that at some point. There's no real. You don't need to play the catch-up game.
There isn't. I mean, because you're always developing your own practice. And for me, a few months ago, longer than that ago, years ago, I started with like some personal projects, which I are on my blog, of defining certain terms that I thought were, for me anyway, really important to be able to have a in-depth discussion and exchange about the subject movement. So one of them, of course, is the term movement perspective, and the other term is movement practice. So for me, the movement perspective is essentially the frame or the filter through which you view your entire experience. So there are other words for this as well, right? I mean, your outlook, your world perspective, your worldview. However, it's influenced by the concept as well, whether consciously or in any case it is, that everything is subject to movement as an underlying condition. Everything can be reduced to movement. Everything has the element that it moves. Further to that, then you develop a movement practice. And the movement practice is not the same as the physical practice. The physical practice is the training element, whether that's your BJJ, whether that's your floor acrobatics, whether that's your handstand work, that's your physical practice, as I see it. So that would come under the heading of your movement perspective. And so what is a movement perspective? For me, it's the way that you conduct yourself and practice yourself and whatever physical practice and other movement aspects you're interested in, how you practice them and conduct them in your daily life. So part of your movement practice, okay, you may have quote unquote been missing the boat on the soft acrobatics, but if you're improving your relationships with your friends or with your partner, with your family, that's something that can't be, underestimated. That's something huge. If you haven't been practicing physically, your physical practice, but you've been thinking a lot and reading a lot and writing a lot, maybe you've started creating more art, something you did in the past, but then you didn't so much now because your physical practice took over. And for me, this is a really important balance to have, because essentially in the back of my mind, it's like, what's the point of being a really amazing physical practitioner and you're a dick and no one likes you and you're really bad at making, you're really bad at making other people feel comfortable in certain situations. Or for example, if you're a fantastic movement practitioner, but you can't cook a good meal, for me, that would be an area that's of much more need of development than perhaps your floor acrobatics. This is my perspective. So although the stuff that we see through Instagram and through the social media of the certain trends within movement culture, that more people are working on floor work, more people are working with object manipulation or whatever it is they're doing. There are other things way beyond the physical practices that for me are equally, if not more important than the physical element itself. Because it comes down to this. If you had no physical practice whatsoever, would you still be a movement practitioner? The answer is no. For me, that's pretty sad, because there are many, many people who have extremely limited movement ability, whether it's through disability or something else. And yet, without trying to sound sick, they can still be movement practitioners, fantastic movement practitioners. Some people think I'm being sick when I say to them that for me, Stephen Hawking was an incredible movement practitioner. Intellectually, of course, he was specializing in that area as well.
I mean, think about this: the resourcefulness of somebody that was able to articulate his thoughts using micro movements of his facial musculature. Like the movements he was able to do, the amount of specialization he developed in his face in order to do that, it's incredible. It's incredible. But you put things in perspective right now. You put things in perspective. Yes, you make a really profound point. Just the fact that you asked that question made me question my own practice, actually, which is like, nice one. This is gonna take me some time to digest. How did you phrase the question again? if you were to remove all the elements of your physical practice, would you still regard yourself as a movement practitioner?
Yeah, so essentially, if you didn't have physical practice, and the point I'm trying to get at is it's my belief that you don't even need a physical practice to be a movement practitioner. You don't even need a physical practice to be interested or to explore movement. A movement practice, a physical practice is definitely a fantastic thing to have because it's like, in terms of physical movement, it's the most immediate thing we have. And it's a huge sensory input, like the physical body. However, to say that if you're not doing one-arm handstands, or let's say to say that if you're not exploring a lot of physical practices or different movement aspects physically, that you're somehow perhaps not as developed or not as explored a movement practitioner as someone else, is not always going to be true. We have to take into the intellectual movement elements. We have to take into account the cognitive elements. We have to take into account that some people are just so awesome to be around, and you feel so good around them, and they meet anyone and they're immediately a friend with the person. They have no enemies. You can rely on them. This person has developed something that, you know, the rest of us could envy, just to be able to naturally get on with people without trying to kiss ass. You know, this is something that I think also can be developed. I mean, in my past, most definitely, I've had to specifically say, okay, this social skill of mine is weak, but I need to try and improve this somehow. And I deliberately put myself in situations where it's, you know, very, very uncomfortable. And that would be the training element of it. And that would be an element of your movement practice.
Yeah, that takes a huge burden off of, well, at least I would say my back. You know, it's instead of trying to constantly live up to the standards of what has came to be known as the movement culture. If you start changing your perspective a little bit and thinking of it in the terms you just put the entire thing right now, there's a sense of relief, I must say. It's nice. It feels nice. It feels nice, and it's also kind of makes you think. It's like, what do I really want, and why am I really doing what I'm doing? Am I doing this to satisfy my ego? Am I doing this to make others happy? Am I trying to do this to feel accepted as part of a group? What am I really seeking in doing the things that I'm doing?
Definitely. And then that comes back to what we said earlier about if you're sharing or teaching. This is something that I believe that you should go into depth with, because this is exactly what you are sharing too. If that's not what you're sharing, then it would, I mean, the stuff that you're sharing, you can just find on YouTube.
Exactly. It's technical expertise.
You can find something. Yeah, exactly. It's something else.
Technical expertise nowadays is really easy to find. Like you said, you can find it online. You can find it online. You don't really need to go to a workshop. You go to a workshop so that you could build a relationship with the person you're trying to study under. You're not necessarily trying to learn the skill per se, because YouTube. I mean, that wasn't the case, let's say, 15, 20 years ago, but nowadays that's the case. You can learn anything.
Yeah, definitely.
YouTube.
Yeah, I started training at 14, and it was bodybuilding practice that I was immediately involved in. So the place where I worked at the time, which was picking crab meat, which involves the systematic dismantling of crustaceans and removing their juicy cooked innards. I used to do that for multiple hours a day. And so one of the guys that I worked with was involved in bodybuilding practice as well. And yeah, you know what? When I was younger, I think I just had this, like many people do, young guys, I guess, this, it wasn't even an idolization, but I was really, really fascinated with muscle, but not in the way that, like the strength and the lifting and stuff. I was really curious about the aesthetics and the shape of it. I never had any like fantasies and things about it, but I related, for example, strongly to The Rock when I used to watch a lot of wrestling. So whether the the analyst wants to call this homoeroticism, go for it. I was homoerotic, but anyway, yeah. I remember one day I always used to think I could see the muscle, and I always wondered if you touch it, because I'd never been around I had no friends or like friends of my family or adults that were this muscly. I always wondered if you touch that, is it soft or is it hard? Like the muscle. I must have been about like 10 at the time, 11. But I was just really curious. I was like when is it? Because I know it's skin and my musculature, my thing is just like soft. But surely it's not just like rock when you touch it. That's really weird. So anyway, I always had, I guess, this predisposition to an interest in muscle. And I was a big, without knowing it as well, I was a big Arnold Schwarzenegger fan. Like, I never really realized it until I kind of looked back and went, nah, man, I used to watch a lot of Arnie films. And so call it social conditioning, whatever have you, that's the way it was. So I was attracted to essentially developing muscle. And so he started writing me some programs. I had some weights at home. I started training at home between the ages of 14 and 16. I just did home training.
Just to pause for 1 second, though. It seems to be a recurrent theme with every single male I've interviewed so far. Between the ages of 13 to, let's say, 17, the early teen years, every single one of us has sort of ended up in some sort of weightlifting regimen. Whether it be bodybuilding, powerlifting, just lifting weights. I honestly, it's eerie and it's kind of weird to hear it from every single person. It's like around 14, 16, and I'm thinking 13, 14, 15, testosterone starts to ramp up. Yeah. You want to start impressing chicks. You have some aggression that you need an outlet. Weightlifting allows for that aggression it allows for that outlet. So I was like, man, it's the same. It's always sort of the same in the beginning, and then it sort of starts to change. So anyway, I just wanted to share that brain fight.
Yeah, I mean that's quite clear. I mean the gendered element of training with weights, which thankfully has changed a lot now in a good way because of CrossFit. Bodybuilding kind of brought it in, but not in a nice way, in my opinion. But CrossFit, in terms of the empowerment that, from what I've seen, that a lot of women get from it, and coming to the understanding that actually, to be honest, the physicality in terms of physical potential of a man or a woman are no different. Of course, we know that now, but in the past, it was like, no, the girls, these are exercises for the girls, and these are exercises for the guys. And that I'm glad that complete BS is almost dead and buried. So yeah, I was involved in that. And then at the age of 16, I started training 3 times a week and also playing a bit more sports. And by the time I was 18, I was, 4 times a week. I was eating as well, the 6 to 8 meals a day by the time I was 18. So it took me about 4 years to develop from essentially what began as, I say, more fitness kind of type stuff, although in my mind with the goal of muscles. So 18, where I was like, as Frank Fussell would say from his really entertaining book called Muscle, The Confessions of an Unlikely Bodybuilder. He calls it the disease. So by 18, I got the disease perfectly. And so yeah, every single edition of Flex Muscle, that's where I got my bro science. I used to read some stuff online and things like that, and I picked up books here and there. But I could talk to you about all the popular supplement stacks and things like this. I was giving out advice to people.
Proper meathead.
Proper meathead, yeah. I mean, just to give you an idea, I mean, I stand at like 172, or 5'6", 5'7" for the Brits. And I weighed, like, now I'm like 67 kilos. Then I was like 84 kilos.
Opa.
Yeah. So like, imagine me now with like a good like 13 kilos.
Yeah, man, that requires a lot of maintenance. That requires a lot of food.
16 kilos.
Man.
Yeah. Yeah, it was crazy. It was crazy. Like, I think about it now, and like now I eat like sometimes only once a day, big. And I maintain myself perfectly fine. And then just to think what I was eating then, and actually just up until a couple of years ago as well, I still had this, it was stuck with me. So yeah, I did that. I was bodybuilding till the age of 18 and then what I started to call the transition started happening about like 7 years ago when I was 24, when I was in Australia.
And how did that come about?
Things started to change. Well, so by then I was a personal trainer, and
a working personal trainer or just certified?
Yeah, a working personal trainer. So I was a working personal trainer then, and I'll rewind just a little bit just to give some backdrop from it. So when I was at university, from the age of like 19 until 21 or something, in England, I was training there a lot, and that was one of the times where I had a couple training partners. I had one guy who was huge. He was awesome. I used to assist him with, he used to do 35 kilo negative curls for 6 reps, like strict ones. It was really awesome. I had another guy who was, both of them in good shape. So we used to meet and train a lot, and of course, like, talk all about supplements and more awesome things like that. And then I was in the gym, and then there was a guy who was a PT, and he was telling people how to do stuff and things like that. And just being, at the time for me, a bit more of a big-headed type of meathead, in the back of my mind, I was like, this is bullshit. What you're advising them to do is bullshit. Actually, looking back reflectively, his advice is probably a lot better than mine, because he was coming from, to be honest, a better perspective. I knew only the bodybuilding perspective. That was it.
But at the time, you knew everything.
Of course. I mean, It's the what's it called? The blah blah curve. When you get to the certain point and you think, yeah, I know absolutely everything. I was at the peak of that curve.
It's the arrogance of youth, I would call it.
Arrogance of youth curve. Yeah. No, so basically I knew everything, and I was like, well, if I know everything, everyone else needs to know this from me as well. And so I was like, this is BS. I'm going to do a PT qualification. I wanted to do a PT qualification. You know what? Just so I could tell people what to do.
Okay. That was the motivation.
And then people had to listen to what I had to say. It was a bit less than that, but to be honest, in the general terms, I wanted to have a qualification that proved the knowledge that I had, because I did have a lot of knowledge. I mean, I trained many people using my techniques that I used, which was a mixture of a type of German volume training mixed with HIIT, not as HIIT is known today, but the Dorian Yates, Mike Metzger type of high intensity training. I used a mix between these two, and I used to batter people. I used to batter myself, but I used to batter people.
Just on a side note,
I never get gains.
If you look at Gordon Ryan's, if you know who Gordon Ryan is, he's like this up and coming. Well, he's an ADCC world champion in BJJ, and he went from a skinny, scrawny little kid to like a massive, really strong, buff dude within the period of like what, a year, like maybe even less than a year. And he put out a DVD on how he became like strength for grappling. And I haven't watched the DVD, but from the reviews I've read so far, it seems like all he does is a fuck ton of reps and a fuck ton of exercises and a fuck ton of sets. Like a lot. Like way more than any trainer would ever advise you to do. And it's funny because we tend to think we know how the human body works, and we tend to think of, oh yeah, the body works, certain muscle tissue responds to certain reps and sets, and then certain amounts of time under tension, and so on and so forth. And if you hold eccentrics versus concentrics, it will have this kind of effect on the muscle, and blah 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 blah. And then you have somebody that does the exact opposite of what's recommended in strength and conditioning books, and yet the body comes up with its physiological adaptations that leads to what you see online with Gordon Ryan, which is like a monster beast. Of course, he may or may not be taking steroids, but regardless, the body's going to adapt regardless of what you do, regardless of how smart you are and how smart your training is, right? It's kind of like a funny thing. It's like we think that, if I do the Dorian Yates style of high intensity style training versus if I do that, it'll have a better effect on the body than this thing. But actually, it doesn't really matter what you do, at least in the beginning. It doesn't really matter what you do. Your body's going to respond to the stimulus regardless.
I mean, the comparison we used to make was the Dorian Yates training and Arnold Schwarzenegger training. Arnold Schwarzenegger. Basically, Arnold was in the gym twice a day for like 2.5 hours, hitting like 20 sets per body part. Dorian Yates never went more than 45 minutes. And he would do, for biceps, he would do one set, just one set. But it would be drop sets, it would be rest pause, it would be, holding certain contractions, eccentrics, negatives, all these things, it just in one set. And I kind of use that element of training as well as some really basic fundamental elements from strength training more towards German volume training. And that's essentially what I promoted. So, I mean, from that point, once I did my PT qualification, I didn't use it for a while. I worked in a couple gyms just as a gym instructor. And then I went traveling. And then when I was finally in Australia, where I lived for a year, I got a job as a personal trainer. And I would just say that if you are a fitness personal trainer, if you land yourself in a facility which has a culture of personal training and also is good to their staff, you can do really well. Like if I stayed in that work doing what I was doing then as a fitness PT, I would have been doing fantastic.
What do you mean by doing
like the
fantastic?
other guys?
Like career-wise, financially? What do you mean?
Financially, yeah. I mean, at the time, people. Well, this is in 2013. They were paying I was cheap. They were paying like $60 for a 1 hour session. And other people were charging like $80 for US dollars for like a 1 hour session, which is really, really good money in 2013, 2012 it was. And it kept increasing and my schedule was full. I had PT clients from morning until evening.
Yeah, man, if you do 100 hours a month, that's like what, 25 hours a week? 25 hours a week is a part-time job and you end up making $8,000.
Yeah, definitely. But I mean, this space had a culture of personal training, by which I mean that there were like 8 PTs or more working there, and all of them had business and people were used to having personal training. So I think advice for people who are still working within the fitness realm, really be selective. If you're just starting out, be really selective of where you choose to work. I know that's not always a possibility for everyone.
It's actually, for those of you that are listening to this, it is a possibility for almost everyone. Okay. It's just, it requires certain sacrifices, such as dumping your girlfriend or, quitting your job or
moving location,
maybe going broke for the first 3 months until you establish a client base, that it's always possible. It's just, it requires certain sacrifices. And the question you need to answer is whether or not you're actually willing to go through that. It might also mean other sacrifices that are a little bit more subtle are sacrifices such as compromising your own practice, because when you're working in a PT gym, you're counting reps and sets a lot of the times. And especially if you're a movement practitioner, that's not really what you want to be doing, like helping people learn how to do bench pressing and dumbbell bicep curls and that kind of stuff. It may kill you inside a little bit. But if your goal is to make money,
hit it. So yeah, I mean, I was in this place, and I was I thought this was it. This was the best job in the world for me, PT, and I got all these clients. And it was only after a few months I started to see the other side of it. For me, was that I was coaching these people, but they weren't training. Like, I wanted people to train. I wanted people to improve. I wanted people to follow my methods, and I wanted essentially people to follow the type of practice that I had in terms of like a bodybuilding practice, which for me, in my mind, I was still stuck in the mindset that if you go to a gym, everyone is there for aesthetics. Now, in the fitness gym, this is perhaps true for a good amount, or perhaps the majority of the people. But I remember telling a climbing friend, I was saying to him, like, everyone in the gym, you're only in the gym there for aesthetics. Everyone there is there to build an aesthetic physique or to make themselves look better. And he was arguing, he was telling me, quite rightly, but no, people go there also to improve like certain conditioning or certain elements. He was saying, I'm a climber. I might go there, but I would use it not for aesthetics, but as a support for my sport. And I was like, nah, but you're in there as well to build it. So I thought, I was giving people what they needed. Really, it was my obscure idea of what people were there for. In any case, I felt like people weren't training hard enough. And then it started to become a bit like, for me, I was programming people programs that they weren't properly doing, where some people, they used to say, oh yeah, this client's great. You put them on a treadmill for half an hour and just chat away. I hated that. Like, I did not want to chat to you. I want you to train. That's it. And so I quickly got the reputation of being, the hard ass, but I wasn't trying to be the hard ass. That's just all I knew. Like, we train.
Yeah, and you're paying me money for it. You're paying me money for this. It's like, come on, get your money's worth.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So, and this was the time when working in this facility, there was a girl there. She used to do basically back walkovers through the whole place, and she would be walking on her hands. And then I remembered when I was younger that I used to walk on my hands a bit. It was like a childhood thing. It was, in my mind, it was the thing that I was good at. I could just jump on my hands and walk a little bit. And then, of course, I tried it, and my inner child cried because I couldn't stand on my hands, my wrists, my shoulders hurt, everything. And I was like, oh, my God, as Iro would say, I shit the bed. I was like, oh, my God. So I started out, first of all, just asking some tips about how to walk on my hands, started developing some handstand walking, could walk a few meters. And then from there, I started becoming interested in the hand balancing stuff because when I was researching hand balancing, I came into contact with calisthenics. And of course, calisthenics for someone who is transitioning from bodybuilding is a very easy, light transition to make. Which basically means that you kind of reduce your weight training a lot and just start doing bodyweight stuff.
And the attitude towards training, it's like hard training, man. Training. So it's the same kind of attitude. You're not necessarily trying to be soft or elegant. You're more.
I know, yeah. I was brutal. So I mean, when I turned to calisthenics, I would like for lower body, it was like pistols, 30, 40 reps, lunges, 500 meters. It was brutal. It was even worse, almost worse than the bodybuilding leg training. But yeah, so from there, after a few years, I was doing calisthenics for about 2 or 3 years, maybe 4. And then I was at the time in South Korea. And I became a bit disillusioned and got a bit down because my pull-up numbers weren't going up. My pull-up numbers is like, what is this? Trying all these different methods, couldn't increase my pull-ups. getting really, really down. Then I got a bit of an injury. And then around Christmas time, I was on the internet, and then I found something from Ido Portal, and it was more about, he was referring to the paradigm shift, like the changing of mindset. And I recognized that's kind of what had happened in me before. And then I also realized that I could solve this problem of the pull-ups. I could simply just make the pull-ups not a priority. And then it went away. And I was like, okay, I don't need more than 15 pull-ups. And then in my mind, it went away.
Once you start, once you stop attaching, what how was it? I think it was this guy called Half Beast, Corey. He was making this point, which was an interesting one. He was saying that, he was attaching his identity to some arbitrary number, the weights that he would be able to snatch, and at some point he was like, you just try to break through that plateau, for whatever reason. It's you try to hit that arbitrary number, and in doing that, you get frustrated. You're no longer happy with your practice. You don't feel satisfied, and the worst of it is, you fucking get injured. You get injured, just super annoying. And the solution sometimes is not trying to find the best method towards breaking that plateau, which sometimes it is. Sometimes it is, because that's part of the process, doing your research and figuring out different methods and trying to solve the puzzle. But sometimes the solution is just let go. Let go, move on to something else.
Definitely.
It's enough.
I mean, that's the idea as well of you can do what you want, but you can't want what you want. Because within the frame of calisthenics, I could do whatever I wanted, within calisthenics. The same as within bodybuilding. You could do whatever you want within this, of course. And of course, when you're stuck within that, if that's not really perhaps what you want, then you can't want what you want. You can do whatever you want of what's available. So as soon as I just realized to myself that actually, you know what? I don't actually want to be doing this work for pull-ups. And for what? It's just because I thought I had to, because that's what you do in calisthenics, right? And then when I started exploring more things, that's when I started to think, no, actually, this is what I want. This type of movement freedom, this development of movement potential, this more lateral exploration, this kind of more, for me, more thought-provoking as well, because I've always been one to kind of reflect on my stuff. It kind of tied more closely with those things. I started to write a lot more with regards to my practice, which I never did before. I did before, actually. I used to write about bodybuilding. But I was able then to find a much greater application in terms of more philosophical perspectives that I have, perhaps. They started to find more of a unity with that. So I mean, this could all change. I hope it does.
As you notice over the years, things change. You stay with something for 3-4 years, and at some point you reach a point where you're like, this is not enough for me. I've developed an identity around this, and I just need to let go and move on to the next thing. And then you move on to the next thing, and you do that for 4 or 5 years, and then you move on to the next thing. So it's like we're constantly evolving, which is nice to know. That's part of the lesson. It's like.
And I think the idea would be that, and it's something that Ido Portal mentioned before, is within the frame of movement as a container for your movement. Although, of course, within that, you might change your orientation and focus after a few years, focus on more different stuff. Like I have, I've completely moved away from strength exploration. Still maintain it, but it encompasses that. So even though I'm no longer focused on those things like building strength and mobility, I have what I consider enough to do other stuff. But it's still within my movement practice.
Exactly.
Yeah. Movement. Even if I spend 3 years now going with Russian Systema or BJJ, it's still my movement practice.
Exactly. Yeah.
As I understand it, and as I feel, it will always be my movement practice, which is why I was also attracted to this container, because this container it allows you to switch between, and it's not like I'm getting worse at this, because through that container, because it's almost all. The underlying thing is synonymous. it always improves one another. If I cook a really, really great dish for 10 people and it was a recipe I didn't do before and it turned out well, for me, that was a contribution to my movement practice.
And I see it a little bit like a bookshelf. You could read a book, it's fresh in your mind, you have all the concepts, you put it back on the shelf. Over time, you'll forget a lot of it, but you kind of have the general idea of it, and you could always go back to it and refresh your memory by going back to that book and reading it again, which is, this is how I kind of see the movement practice. It's like, oh, I trained jiu-jitsu for 3 years. I got really good at it. I know how to articulate things physically. If I put it back on the shelf, I don't need to throw it in the garbage. Doesn't mean because I stopped doing it that I'm abandoning it completely. I just put it back on the shelf and I work on something else for a certain period of time. That may be calisthenics. And I get really good at calisthenics. But I notice also with certain things tend to leave you faster than others. Like, for example, jiu-jitsu doesn't tend to leave you as quickly as powerlifting, the strength you get from powerlifting. It's like the strength gains you get from a planche. A planche will leave you a lot faster than the knowledge you get from jiu-jitsu. The one-arm pull-up is going to leave you much faster than the I don't know, say, learning how to run. A nice little comment, one of the other guys I interviewed recently, he says, lately I've only been practicing skills that I would not lose on the Camino de Santiago.
Yeah.
And I was like, that took me some time to think about it, because when you do the Camino, you're walking for like, what, a month and a half, 2 months?
Yeah.
And if you don't train the planche for 2 months, unless you've been doing it since you were a kid, probably you're going to lose it. So it's like, what skills can I practice that I would not lose on the Camino? And I was like, that's an interesting approach to training. That's actually an interesting approach to training.
And it's the more you specialize as well. I mean, if you, not just specialization, but I mean, the more linear you go and the more you pursue, for example, a movement hierarchy, the ones at the end of the movement hierarchy, those top end skills, they will leave you. As one guy was speaking before about gains in regards to ex-bodybuilders, and he says, he compares them and he says, see these gains were not loyal. And I talk about,
nice.
Yeah, but I talk about loyal movements. I mean, if this movement isn't loyal to you, if it doesn't serve you and it just disappears after a few months, is it worth spending the time working on? For a movement, well, for my movement practice, I would agree with your friend. Yeah, no.